As Dr. Rupp said, our hospitalization length varies a lot. We've had a few people that come in that are well at baseline. They're sick enough to be in the hospital. They're here for a few days or several days. When they get to the ICU, which is where I work, our median length of stay is 22 days for the people that make it to the ICU, and that's people on ventilators and not. For the patients that go on to a ventilator, our typical course is about 3 to 5 weeks on the ventilator, and it's nationwide, it's 50% mortality rate if you end up on a ventilator with COVID-19. So that has been pretty consistent throughout the pandemic. We may be seeing a little bit of an improvement with some of the therapeutics that we now have, but that's going to take time to really see whether that's signal or noise. We're hopeful that it is helping, but as Dr. Rupp said, really big variability. This virus seems to affect different people in extremely different ways, and it's not always the people you predict that don't do well. We have had people in their 40s die in the ICU here. We've had people in their 30s on ventilators for 5 weeks. So the myth that this only affects elderly people or really frail people is exactly that. It's a myth. Yeah, the ICU beds in the Omaha metro area right now are 85% full. So as we head into a normal flu season, 85% occupancy of ICU beds makes people like me uneasy because we know we're going to have an increase in patients coming into the ICU and needing ventilators. We do every year. So the thought of having a flu season and a COVID-19 pandemic on top of it at the same time makes us extremely uneasy. I mean, we were far beyond ICU capacity in May. We opened up multiple units, 3 additional units that were dedicated to COVID, and we were completely packed. And we started that at 50% capacity. We're going into this at 85% capacity. And that's part of the reason why we made this statement and part of the reason why we wanted to kind of get the word out to Omaha and to the rest of the state that we have, individual people, we all have the power to slow this down. But if people do not change the way we are currently behaving, we are not going to have capacity. And the assumption that you can get, if you get sick, that we're going to have a hospital bed for you is a false assumption. We can fill. Lincoln can fill, Omaha can fill, Grand Island can fill, all of our hospitals can fill up. And then you could be sick with COVID-19 outside of an emergency department, and we may not have capacity. That's really the main message, at least from my perspective.
So early in the course of the pandemic, we drew up extensive contingency plans that would include having emergency shelters as we have erected outside the emergency department. We do have those plans in place to how we would potentially expand. We did demonstrate that we can create capacity within the system by completely curtailing elective surgeries, by decreasing the number of patients that come into our ambulatory clinics. We very much hope that we don't have to resort to those sorts of activities again because they obviously come with some degree of harm.
Yeah, so our testing capabilities continue to rely on our centralized laboratory facilities that are here and servicing the state through Test Nebraska. There are a variety of new technologies that have begun to reach patients and communities in Nebraska and nationwide that are creating new opportunities to obtain testing in both outpatient settings as well as even home-based collection settings. So these improvements in technology and the increase in availability of authorized tests that can be obtained in alternate settings will certainly help us to expand our access to testing statewide.
Right. Well, I think a couple of things, important things that people should keep in mind about testing. First of all, timing makes a big difference. So I think there's a misperception that if you're exposed to even a confirmed case, and then you go and get a COVID test, whether it's a day later or 2 days later or 4 days later, if that test is negative, then you're in the clear, and that's not the case. These diseases, all infectious diseases essentially have what's called an incubation period, a period of time between when you're infected and when you actually become ill, and we can detect infection. And that incubation period in COVID, we know, can be up to 14 days. And so that idea of 14 days of quarantine is still very important. Even if you get tested a few days after exposure, it does not mean that you will not later on go on to develop symptoms. So I think that is one of the sources of misinformation, that people think, well, it was a false negative. It actually was not a false negative. It was true. You do not have manifestations of disease right now. You're just still in the incubation period. The second issue is with some of the new tests that Dr. Broadhurst brought up. We do worry about the sensitivity of those tests. They are not as sensitive as the laboratory-based PCR tests that we do here in our hospital, which are the most sensitive. And so we need to keep that in mind. Those tests have been used particularly in some circumstances in screening nursing home patients, and in other situations, those antigen tests in particular are the ones that are most broadly available and lack the sensitivity of PCR tests. So they need to be used very carefully in the correct context and by professionals who understand how to interpret the results.